Hello, hello. Thank you so much for tuning into this ASMR true crime soft spoken video. I've been gone again. I'm so sorry. I haven't stopped thinking about it. I want to be consistent again, but life has been very chaotic. But I found a case that I found so interesting, and it reminded me, it started from the case of Cindy James, and from there I found out about this case. So there's some similarities, and I think I want to do the Cindy James case next. So let's get into the case of Ruth Finley. Just a little warning, it's true crime. There's a couple parts that are a little graphic, but I also saw that Netflix may be turning this into a series. So if it happens, and all these ASMR people come out with this case, you know where you are first. Okay. Ruth Smock was born on February 1st, 1930, in Richards, Missouri. She grew up in rural Kansas, in a town called Fort Scott during the Depression era, which created very hard times for her family that experienced poverty. It's reported that her parents used very strict discipline. They were against emotional expression. There's a lot of emphasis on not crying or asking for help, but to be very stoic. On October 15th, 1946, Ruth was 16 years old, and she had just returned to her house after buying groceries when she heard the door open behind her. Suddenly, she was grabbed by a tall man. He was described as wearing dirty overalls and looking to be about 50 years old. Ruth was able to jab the man in the eyes with her thumbs, and then he shoved a rag of chloroform over her mouth, and she began to become unconscious. Her last image before passing out was of a man heating a flat iron on the stove. When she woke up, she had first-degree burns on both thighs. She also had scratches on her face, arms, and legs that were inflicted by a knife. I don't think they ever caught this man from what I could find. So she went through this horrific assault as a teen. And just due to her childhood and the state of difficulties she had, she wanted to find a better life, which was the initial connection when she met Ed Finley, who had a similar background growing up in poverty. The two married and went on to move to Wichita, Kansas, in a quiet neighborhood, and had 2 sons together. Ruth was described as a very quiet and soft-spoken woman who worked in the security department at a phone company. Her husband, Ed, was an accountant and described to be all around just a good guy. In 1977, Ruth was 47 years old and Ed was 50, their sons had both moved out and they were settling into the transition of being empty nesters. Ruth continued working at her long-term employment at Southwestern Bell. In June of 1977, Ed collapsed from a suspected heart attack after working in their yard. After being admitted into the hospitals and awaiting tests, Ruth went home to get some rest, but was very emotionally distraught from this. Later in the evening, while at home, she receives a phone call. Of course, she's on edge, hoping it's not the hospital calling her, but instead, she hears an unfamiliar man asking if she was Ruth Smock from Fort Scott, Kansas. Ruth says yes, but she's very confused because he knows her maiden name and knows where she lived decades ago. The man goes on to begin reading out loud an article from Fort Scott Tribune, which described her attack from when she was 16 years old, and he asked her if she was still wearing her brand. 31 years had passed since this attack, so Ruth was very confused by this phone call, very just taken aback by who this was, why they were calling. He states that he works for a construction company that was tearing down old houses in Fort Scott when he found the newspaper clippings in a wall. Okay, hear me out for a second, I'm sorry. I hear about this, like, just shit being in walls all the time. I don't understand how that happens. How? Like, did you create a hole and put stuff in it and then get some spackle and drywall? Okay, anyway, sorry. He then goes on to threaten her and instructs her to send him money. Ruth then hangs up the call and goes right to sleep, feeling awful about this interaction. I don't know what he could threaten her with because, like, she did something. Ed continued to stay in the hospital for an additional week. Doctors were able to determine that he had not suffered a heart attack, but had complications from his injury from a car accident a year ago. Ruth continued feeling on edge throughout the week, awaiting for another phone call, but none came. When Ed returned from the hospital, she tried to shake off that interaction and focus on taking care of Ed and returning to their quiet life. Later that summer, while at work, Ruth received a letter with her name scrawled on the envelope in messy handwriting. Inside was the newspaper clipping from the article written 31 years ago about her assault. She tore the article in pieces and discarded it into the trash. So over the next several months, Ruth begins receiving phone calls from the same unidentified man, to which she would quickly hang up. At this time, she did not tell her husband about the calls or the envelope. In August of 1977, Ruth was walking around the shops in downtown Wichita when a man came up from the crowded crosswalk and began to walk right beside her. At first, she didn't really notice the man until he started telling her how much of a good job she was doing at work, and that she could take the weekend off. No shit, Sherlock. The man was described as 5'9", in his late 40s, skinny, with black hair that was graying around the temples. He starts asking her about her job and what she does, and then asks if she would want to go to Las Vegas, where he recently won some money. Ruth kept walking and did not engage in any of the conversation, hoping the man would just walk off. The man then says, "The camera reflects the true quality of one's soul." Ruth is now annoyed and tells the man that she's waiting for her husband. Now me, I would have said my knee reflects the true quality of your balls, but her response was good too. The man switches his tone to an even more creepy state, if you can believe it, and tells her that he likes her face, and that some people's fantasies are other people's nightmares. So, she eventually can walk away from this man, and she finally meets up with Ed and tells him about the weirdo that she bumped into. And they just assume at this point it's just some creepy man who was trying to pick up women. So a year goes by and Ruth never sees this man and just goes on with her life. But then in June of 1978, she is walking around the downtown shopping area when she feels someone reach out and grab her wrist. And when she looks, it is the same man from the previous summer. She yanks her wrist free and dashes across the street to the Macy's for her safety. And as she is running, she hears the man yell, "Ruth, get back here, you stupid bitch, and talk to me." Once inside, she calls Ed to come and get her immediately. When she sees him, she tells him about the assault that happened when she was 16, about the phone calls, and about the second encounter with this man. Very alarmed, Ed decides he should contact the police, and he later goes to the station to file a report. The police end up doing no follow-up to this report, because at the time, in 1978, in Wichita, Kansas, the BTK killer was 3 years into his span of crime and murdering victims in the area. So the police were in full focus to catch the BTK killer, and often reports like this were just being dismissed. In October, Ruth received an unmarked envelope with her name scrawled on the front in tall black letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper that read, "Fuck you, fuck the police, fuck the telephone company, give me your money or you will be hurt." She gave Ed the letter when he returned home, and Ed then insisted on going to the police station again. On November 6th, Ruth and Ed drove to the Wichita Police Department headquarters, where they were directed to the Criminal Investigation Division on the 5th floor. They met the Lieutenant Bernie Chawatsky, who was a seasoned detective of 34 years. Typically, the division did not handle cases like this that were minor, but the BTK strangler having similar threatening letters, he decided to look more into the case to see if there was a possible link to BTK. Ruth explained to him the occurrences she experienced, but there was not much to do, and he had to refocus on priority cases. But the following week, Ruth received another letter, in which the writer demanded $100. He wrote out a threatening statement and also wrote a crude poem. This letter mentions his despise for Attila's spies. I don't know what the telephone company did to this man, but they are mentioned every damn time in these letters. So Ruth brought the letter to Lieutenant Trotsky, and as more letters came in, Ed would pass it along to the lieutenant, who would send it off to be fingerprinted. As time went on, the letters became more of a mess, with misspellings, abbreviations, and made-up words. Ruth began typing up clean copies of the letters for the lieutenant to make them easier to decode. The writer frequently referenced her brands and had a fascination with her burns. Phone calls also continued to come in as well. And when Ed would answer, it was usually just a dial tone or just a hang up. Finally, the calls had stopped, and they became hopeful that this might mean the stalker had moved on. So on November 21st, 1978, Ruth goes out to lunch and runs errands during her lunch break at work. After leaving a greeting card shop, she crosses North Market Street. As she is walking, a blue-green 1964 Chevrolet Bel Air pulls up in front of her. A bit alarmed, she begins looking around the area, and she notices that there is only an elderly woman walking a bit away, but there are no other people around. When she examines the car in front of her, someone gets out of the car, and she realizes that it is the same man who had confronted her twice before on the street. He approaches her and asks her if she has the money he requested, and then kicks her in the shin. He then grabs her and pushes her into the back seat of the vehicle and climbs next to her. In the driver's seat is another man drinking a bottle from a paper bag. She notices that in this back seat, it is filled with junk. On the floor, there's like a gas can, concrete pieces, chains, rags. The door handle where Ruth was is broken, and the car's left rear window is covered in plastic. The man takes Ruth's purse and pulls out her money and safe deposit key. He then discovers her business card from the detective, which angers him, and he grabs a piece of concrete and slams it into Ruth's head, which causes her to collapse in her seat. At this point, Ruth is very dazed and disoriented. She is in the back seat trying to refocus and trying to comprehend what the two men are saying, if there's any identifiable markers for where they're driving. At one point, they pull the car over at Twin Lakes Shopping Center, and they talk about how the car had not been properly fixed. Ruth begins to understand the men are talking about where to get rid of her as they are driving around. Ruth remembers that there is a can of mace in her purse, but the purse is laying in between her and the man in the back seat. So after 4 hours of just driving around randomly throughout the city and area, Ruth tells the men that she has to pee and begins forcing herself to gag, telling them she will throw up if they do not stop and let her go to the bathroom. Ruth's abductors instruct the driver to stop at a small park near West 21st Street. When they arrive, the men have her remove her shoes and sweater so that she wouldn't run away. Her abductors then make her walk down into the park, holding her by the arm. Before leaving the car, Ruth managed to grab her purse, and so as they walk, it gets a hold of the mace. She then is able to turn to the man and spray him in the face and get away from his grip and run into the park. She finds a large bush to hide where she crouches down. The men are calling out to her, letting her know that she will freeze, and if she returns, they will not hurt her. She remains in this position and waits a very long time, listening out for any signs that they are still there. After some time, she looks up and starts walking towards where the car was previously located and does not see the car parked anymore or any sign of the men. So she's hoping this means that they're no longer searching for her. So she runs out of the park and runs across the street to a liquor store. The owner calls the police and then calls Ed at the request of Ruth. Ed had spent the last few hours searching for her after she'd been reported missing from work earlier that day. When the police come, she is taken in for an interview. It was determined that the kidnappers had stolen her $315 paycheck and an $100 U.S. savings bond. Detectives begin to worry that Ruth was a victim of the BTK strangler due to the overlapping keywords within the letters Ruth received and the letters from the BTK. The key difference, however, was the fact that BTK's trademark was home invasions and murder, not street abductions. The following day, detectives continued the investigation and drove Ruth to the park where she had escaped, looking for any additional clues or details that Ruth could recall. They were able to recover Ruth's sweaters and shoes. They also could trace Ruth's footprints in the area, but no other clues were discovered. Detectives then ran a check for every 1964 Chevy Bel Air in the area, but found no promising leads. For a span of 5 weeks, the police maintained rigorous surveillance on Ruth, during which no suspicious activities were observed, leading to the conclusion of the operation. Ed's employer even offered a $3,000 reward for any information. Detectives end up driving Ruth and Ed to Fort Scott for a 2-day investigation into her assault that occurred when she was a teenager, in the hopes it may discover a possible suspect or connection. Ruth examined mugshots that were taken after the assault in 1946, but there were no leads. Lieutenant Trotsky decides to go on a talk show to discuss the case. And so as incoming calls come in, Ruth and other investigators are listening to see if she can recognize any voices. But again, no leads come from this. In December, Lieutenant receives a letter stating that he was, quote, protecting a whore from death. And then after her kidnapping, Ruth is experiencing psychosomatic symptoms such as daily headaches, stomach cramps, most of which she kept to herself. Both Ed and Ruth were deeply distraught about the ongoing harassment she was experiencing. Ed would spend each night out in their yard hiding with a shotgun waiting for this guy to show up. And throughout the next few months, letters just kept coming in. Each letter was written in bizarre rhyming statements, and the content became increasingly violent and sexual. It's like around this time that Ed develops this nickname for him called the Poet, in reference to the letters and the strange poetry. In July 1979, the letters stop once again, and the couple is hopeful that this is the end. With some relief and hope, they planned their annual summer trip to Colorado. And on August 13th, 1979, Ruth ran out to Dillard's in town east to buy some jeans for the upcoming trip. Ed was really cautious about her going alone, but she confirmed that she was going to be fine. The sun is going down, and around this time, the sun is going down around the time she left Dillard's, and she walks out to the parking lot, and there's not many cars or people around. She gets that kind of feeling, and she begins to hurry to her car and look around the surroundings. As she arrived to her car, she heard the voice of the man, and then she was shoved from behind, and he ordered for her to get into the car and drive him to a bridge nearby. So Ruth was able to break free and begin trying to run around the car, but he was able to grab her and stab her twice in the back and once in the side with an 8-inch knife. She's still able to run to the passenger side door and get inside her car. She then drives off, and once she's at the red light, she realizes that the knife is still sticking out of her side, and she's bleeding heavily. She pulls over into a gas station, and using a payphone, she calls the police station headquarters, a number that she had memorized. The captain picks up and recognizes who Ruth is by knowing the case that Lieutenant Trotsky is working on. I may have said his name differently every single time. He sends a police officer to the gas station, but in fear, she decides to get back into her car and drive the 5 minutes back to her house. At this point, she's losing a lot of blood and becoming increasingly weak. As she pulls into the home, Ed comes outside, and she essentially is like very weak coming out of the car. He then puts her back into the car, into the passenger seat, and takes her to the hospital. Ruth had deep gashes on her back and left arm, and a 2-inch deep wound where the knife was located. They said that if the knife had gone any deeper, it would have been fatal. So she's in the hospital for 9 days after this incident. Later that September, Ed decides that he is going to write a letter to the poet through the classified section, asking what he owes him. He's just gotten fed up without being able to control anything, so it's like this outreach trying to just get this guy to do something, say something, like anything at this point. So the name The Poet begins to circulate in the newspaper, and stories really begin to pick up being covered about Ruth's case. So there's a response from the poet, and in his message he refers to Ruth being the, quote, 7th and hardest to find, which creates more speculation that he might be the BTK strangler. Ed and Ruth are now beginning to hear a lot of noises around their home at night. Ruth finds letters from the poet on the front porch. In October, the newspaper company called the Eagle Beacon reports that the poet had been sending taunting letters to the company for the last 6 months. With more media coverage and communication from the poet, the public begins to worry about the safety of the community. The police continue investigations to find any leads and are still unable to come up with any. Investigators become desperate since there is limited information on possible suspects, so they call in Dr. Donald Schrag in the hopes that hypnosis will help bring any additional information from Ruth, recalling something while under. Ruth has 2 sessions, which brings very few new details to the case. Dr. Schrag determines that the poet has serious emotional and mental problems, likely had psychological treatment with a possibility of a state institution, and he probably has high intelligence. Throughout the couple of years of being the investigator on the case, Dr. Jawotsky and his wife actually grew close with Ed and Ruth, and they frequently socialized together. I think I read that they had common Republican beliefs or something like that. In January 1980, Lieutenant Jawotsky is promoted to vice and organized crime, and the case is taken over by Captain Mike Hill. Soon after this transition, Captain Hill receives a letter from the poet. After Ruth and Ed's phone lines were cut for a second time, Captain Hill installed surveillance cameras in their backyard and assigned detectives to monitor the cameras 24 hours a day from the Finley's dining room. On January 25th, 1980, Ruth reports a phone call at work from the poet, stating he left a surprise for her in the lobby's phone booth at her office. When police arrive, they discover a 12-inch butcher knife wrapped in a red bandana on top of the phone booth. The amount of letters received by the poet increased over the next few weeks. Frustrated with the lack of leads or suspects, police decide to put Ruth in a bulletproof vest and have her walk around the downtown area while undercover police watched and waited. But again, no leads were ever developed from this. Letters from the poet began to surface at various businesses in the Wichita area. There were more than 50 letters sent in a 6-month period to places such as the local morgue, telling them to contact Ruth about its services and she will need it soon. Letters to the gas and electric company instructing them to turn off the Finley's utilities. The health department was told that Ruth was spreading venereal diseases. A construction company was solicited to tear up the Finley's driveway, and the DMV was asked to confiscate Ruth's license because of her hazardous and dangerous driving habits. Ruth's bank was ordered to transfer out all her money. A local florist received a $5 bill with the request that one black flower would be sent to Ruth. This man is a menace. He has a lot of time and energy. So in June 1980, Ruth receives a letter from the poet that was postmarked from Oklahoma City, which was the first one sent outside of Wichita. Oklahoma police received an anonymous call from a woman regarding a man who resembled the poet. Police are hoping that this could be a lead. They discover a man who had worked in Wichita, but had been fired from his job 7 months prior, after which he moved to Oklahoma City. Police flew this man out to do a lineup, and Ruth declared that this was not her attacker despite similarities in physical appearance. Throughout 1980, the harassment targeting the Finleys escalated. Eggs and feces were hurled at the Finleys' residence. A jar of urine was left on their front porch. A unignited Molotov cocktail was discovered on the rear porch, which is one of those bottles with a rag and you light it up and throw it. Firecrackers, cigarettes, hair, matches, and trash were found in their mailbox. Ruth discovered a rock wrapped in the red bandana in the backyard, along with a pair of wire cutters. On Christmas, Ruth and Ed were watching TV in their basement when the wreath on their outside front window was set on fire. In March, the poet wrote that he was going to kill Ruth at the St. Patrick's Day parade. And on April Fool's Day, pieces of concrete were flung at the Finleys' front porch. But neither the neighbors nor Ruth or Ed saw anything suspicious. In the spring of 1981, there were no closer leads to this case. And up until this point, the police chief, Richard LeMunyon, had not been personally involved in this case. He really erred on trusting his detectives being able to run their own investigations. However, he had to intensify his involvement because on Friday, September 4th, 1981, the poet sent a letter stating his next victim would be Chief LeMunyon's wife after he takes care of Ruth. On September 5th, the chief takes home the extensive 15-volume case files on the poet for a thorough weekend review, leading him to a startling revelation. On Friday, September 11th, he calls a confidential meeting with 16 of his officers who had been involved on the case. So, Chief LeMunyon told his team that his conclusion is that the poet was Ruth Finley. His reasons were, number one, there had never been a single witness to any of Ruth's encounters with the poet, though they all occurred in public places. Number two, the Finley lived on a dead-end street with little traffic, yet none of the neighbors or station police officers had ever spotted the poet. No, nor were any footprints ever discovered. Number three, the detectives only found a single set of footprints in the park where she had supposedly maced her kidnapper, and that was Ruth's footprints. She also said that the kidnapper had struck her in the face with concrete, but her face showed no injury. Number four, Ruth called the Central Investigations Office in the police department when she was stabbed. Why didn't she call 911? And then she got out of her car to make the call and then back into her car to drive home. How could she do that with a knife in her back? I think it was in her side. Number five, Captain Hill received a letter from the poet as soon as he took over Ruth's case. But only Ruth, Ed, and the police knew Hill had assumed command of that case. Number six, as soon as the recording cameras were placed in the birdhouse, a camera to which only the Finleys and the police were aware of, the poet stopped appearing in Ruth and Ed's yard. Number seven, the poet's message to Ed in the Eagle Speaking classified section stopped whenever the Finleys were on vacation, and they resumed as soon as they returned. So on Monday, September 14th, police started a 2-week surveillance on the Finleys to document every move the couple made. They had at least one undercover police car and one helicopter following them at all times. Aggressive. On September 17th, at 8:30 a.m., Ed drove into... He did not drive into a mailbox. He drove to a mailbox in town, and Ruth placed some mail inside. At 1:30 p.m., police had a postal inspector pick up the mail inside the box and drop it off at the station. Detectives found 5 pieces of mail in a stack that included a personal letter from the Finleys, 2 bill payments from the Finleys, and 2 letters written by the poet addressed to Ruth and a local TV station. Police had witnessed Ruth place this mail inside, but it didn't give enough proof since the time between her dropping it off and it being retrieved could have speculation that someone else could have technically came along and put something in afterwards. On September 26th, the Finleys drove to the mailbox again to drop off mail. Detectives took a picture of Ruth dropping the letters inside the slot. After they pulled off, the police blocked the mailbox and waited for the postal inspector to come and retrieve the mail. 4 letters were found grouped together on the top of the pile from the Finleys. 2 payment bills, 1 personal letter from them, and a letter from the poet to Ruth. So this starts a much deeper investigation into Ruth. They go through thousands of envelopes at the businesses to which the Finleys had mailed their payments, looking for a match with Ruth's handwriting. Police also went to the drop box located in the lobby of Ruth's employer and found several letters from the poet inside. Detectives were tipped off by a suspicious employee, and they got permission to search her office at the phone company by the owner. They discovered a book of poetry, a sheet of torn carbon paper with the poet's handwriting, a red bandana, which was one of the poet's trademarks, wrapped in a used yellow Kleenex in Ruth's desk. They found torn pieces of tablet paper covered with the poet's writing in the trash. That Wednesday, Chief Lemunyon and his wife received another letter from the poet. They were able to trace that letter came from the drop box in Ruth's work lobby. A microscopic fracture analysis matched the bottom half of the letter received to a ripped piece of paper found in Ruth's office trash. This was enough evidence to complete the case, but many investigators were unsure about Ed's involvement, but they felt doubtful that he was in on it. On Thursday, October 1st, Ed was called into the police department. Detectives read him his rights and began interviewing him. So he starts walking through the entire timeline from the start of his hospital stay in 1977. They tell him the evidence they collected and the conclusion of Ruth being the poet. Ed is extremely shocked by this discovery, and he is very confused. He is immediately willing to take a polygraph test regarding his involvement, and he passes. Later that evening, they call Ruth into the department. They begin to interrogate her, and they eventually show her the evidence that they collected, which points to her being the poet. Ruth is very confused, and she's initially denying this. She reports at this time she begins having some fragments of memory of her writing a letter in her basement, but it's not very clear. After some time, she admits to writing the letters, placing the butcher knife in her lobby phone booth, leaving urine and feces on her porch, and making Molotov cocktails from the gas in her car. She said on the day of her reported abduction, she had actually taken a bus to Twin Lakes and then walked over to the river to leave her sweater and shoes for the police to discover. As she's providing these details, Ruth is not completely sure if they are real and has no memory of these acts actually happening, and she acknowledges that she needs help. Ruth told the detectives, quote, "Yes, I wasn't sure I was guilty, but I did know something was very wrong with me. I wish I were dead. I guess I am just crazy." That night, Ruth stays in the hospital and is placed under a 24-hour psychiatric watch. Wichita authorities are deciding whether charges should be pressed. The poet case cost the police department a total of $370,000. But after reviewing her psychological report, they decided to not press any charges due to her actions not being malicious. In November of 1981, Ruth began seeing Dr. Andrew Pickens, a 38-year-old practitioner of psychoanalysis, and they began seeing each other twice a week for therapy. Dr. Andrew Pickens says Ruth created this alter ego because of the sexual abuse she endured as a very young child. He says, quote, "Let me say, she really wasn't terrorizing herself. She was trying to get help for and protect herself from the terror she experienced as a little girl." It was uncovered that Ruth had been sexually abused for almost a year by a neighbor and a family friend. He would take her to his barn and use a red bandana during these assaults. During that time, she states that she would, quote, "float off into heaven," so she could see what was happening to the little girl down below, but it wasn't as bad watching it over actually being the one experiencing it. So dissociative disorders are common among trauma victims, and this is just a defense to get through trauma. We are always trying to survive, so our brain and our body will do anything to survive. And there are a lot of different types of dissociative disorders. I think the most common one we hear is DID, but there's a lot of different ones. And it seems like this one is not dissociative identity disorder. It wasn't a different personality. So Ruth and Dr. Pickens believes that she had repressed these memories for over 40 years, but was triggered by the stress of Ed's hospitalization. Ruth had dealt with the emotional damage by creating another self, the poet. The poet was not like a fully developed identity, but it was like an alternative consciousness, one that Ruth had no memory or awareness of when she was in her regular conscious mind. Ruth spent years in therapy processing all of her trauma. Though many held doubt over her story, she grew to feel more comfortable sharing her story to the world and receiving supports by many. Ruth had actually got on the Oprah show after years of therapy to discuss her experience and share the impacts of severe trauma. You can see this on YouTube or online. She said during the interview, although she has no memory of some of those behaviors, she recognizes the role of her disassociation. But there are some things that she's not quite sure she was responsible for, such as starting the fire on the Christmas wreath, because she was indeed with her husband at the time. She also states that the man who approached her on the street initially did actually happen, and perhaps was what set everything off. She also says that the story from when she was a teen is true too. Ruth went on to live a very happy life with her husband Ed and their family. She passed away Thursday, May 30th, 2019, in Wichita at age 89. In her obituary it states she enjoyed needlework and knitting and donated many hats and scarves to the U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Ruth was a volunteer for the Braille Association of Kansas, manually inputting textbooks into Braille after learning the code. She enjoyed ceramics, walks with her friends, attending symphonies, and musical theater. is the story of Ruth Finley. So, I mentioned Cindy James' case, if you know that case. The connection of, everyone wondering if Cindy James was in fact stalked and terrorized, or if it was her. It's another pretty intense case, and I want to follow up with this, but this was, like a case that kind of reminded people of it, and I had never heard of it, and it was very interesting. So, when that Netflix comes out, I feel like it's going to be hopefully good, but, thank you so much for watching. I'm so sorry again, I've been gone, but tell me what you think about this case. So, I hope that you're having a good day or night wherever you are.